Well, congratulations, friends. It's Friday. You've made it through another work week. Maybe you're watching this in the morning. You've got one more day to go, but you're inspired. You know it's Friday, so that gives you that little extra boost of energy. Also, we're kind of getting close to Thanksgiving, that time of year when we get together, we see family, we enjoy fellowship, which is something for me as I've gotten older. I appreciate so much more, and I hate that I waited so long because some of my loved ones have passed. I don't have the opportunity to get with them anymore. I wished I would have appreciated better what we had when we had it, but I was too immature and didn't realize what I had. But I know what I have now. And that's something I want to focus on today in Romans chapter 1 is something that's present that we all have knowledge of and privilege to, and yet not all have accepted it and responded to that. And that is the knowledge of God. And so Paul here in Romans chapter 1 provides some sound theology in terms of the fact that everyone is accountable to God in terms of how we respond to him. Because everyone has received the same revelation, and those who have received his word have received a special revelation. But, of course, in the context of Romans 1, he's talking about general revelation, creation itself. And then notice what he says. Pick it with me in verse 21. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. So, as I was saying earlier, God has revealed himself, his nature, his eternal power, his divine nature in creation, and we all have exposure to that. We all have the ability to look at that and perceive, number one, intelligence, because even those who might want to hold to something of an evolutionary mindset, they understand that things are just too fine-tuned to give to chance. There has to be a design, which means there has to be a designer. You look at a building, you see it has a certain number of floors, it has a certain size to it, the window looks a certain way. You understand that the builder didn't just randomly pick and choose, that there was an architect who designed that. Then there was a builder who put the picture into reality. And God is both. God is both architect and builder. And so Paul says his invisible attributes, verse 20, they have been understood from creation, so no one has an excuse. Then he goes into the whole premise for how everyone stands condemned before God because of general revelation. We know these things. We know for though they knew God, they did not glorify him or show gratitude, which means respond in submissive obedience, respond in worship. Instead, their thinking became worthless and their senseless hearts were darkened. So he says their minds began thinking and directing to ideas outside of the revelation. It says their hearts became darkened, which speaks to the moral component of what's going on here. He says, claiming to be wise, they became fools. And note this, that the ultimate demonstration of that foolishness, he says, was exchanging the glory of God, the worship of God, the acknowledgement of God, for what we focus toward, things like men, four-footed animals, birds, reptiles, all these different things that have at some point, and maybe still today, serve as some focus of worship, an idol in a sense. And that's the problem, Paul says. Paul says God has provided more than enough revelation to make himself known in a general sense so that man would begin to pursue him in knowledge of him and find that in special revelation. And yet instead of doing that, Paul says, man has rejected God's clear and evident revelation, and through what he thinks is wisdom of himself has become foolish and is now directing all of his allegiance to the creation rather than the creator. Paul says there are ramifications for that. And man are there. Verse 24, therefore, God delivered them over in the darkness of their hearts to sexual impurity, so their bodies were degraded among themselves. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served what has been created instead of the Creator. So fascinating that Paul says the first sign that man has rejected God's revelation and is instead pursuing his own ideas and concepts is sexual immorality. The one area that seems to always infect and affect every culture is sexual immorality. Paul says this is one of the first signs that man has exchanged the glory of God and worship of God for all these other things. So, For this reason, almost like a therefore, verse 26. God delivered them over. Now here's what's fascinating. Notice verse 24, God delivered them over. Verse 26, God delivered them over. Verse 28, God delivered them over. In every instance, it's not that man just kind of went that way. It's that God is allowing man to go that way. Deliver them over sounds like an action that's being carried out by that one, but in this case, it's representing God's restraint being removed. You know, that some of that sense of a natural morality, an innate morality, those senses being, dulled and removed a little bit, and man continuing to follow those almost animalistic instincts. But each of those cases is a result of his rejection of God's revelation, his rejection of God making himself known, and his desire to pursue more knowledge of God through special revelation and ultimately salvation. Paul says as a result of that, three things. He became darkened. It says the desires of his heart became darkened, verse 24. Verse 26, their passions became disgraceful. Verse 28, it says their minds were corrupted, and they were filled with, verse 29, all these things: evil, greed, wickedness, murder, envy, quarrel, deceit, malice. All that we see and we associate with a culture in chaos, Paul says it goes right back to a culture that has rejected God and refused the revelation, instead pursuing their own ideas and concepts, which are very much centered in self and sin. And let this be a warning. In fact, let this be a sign of understanding for us. As we look at our culture today, we oftentimes question, how did we get here? How did we get to a place where something as beautiful and wholesome as the family, but would be rejected and outright, in some cases, tried to be removed, and government would take its place? How did we get to a place where something as beautiful as marriage, one man, one woman for life, would be demonized and not even desired anymore? More people desire to be just in a relationship than in covenant of marriage, which is God honoring. The other is not God honoring. So how do we get to that place? Well, simple. We rejected God's revelation. And for us, it would be God's special revelation. Because in America, God's word is everywhere. Through the efforts of different groups like the Gideons, for instance, and the church, of course. God's word is present everywhere. And yet God's word is not read. God's word is certainly not received and obeyed. And so therefore, we see the consequences of that. It's that slow fade, but it is a destructive fade. And that's what Paul's describing for us here, setting up the scenario for God's grace. Takes chapter 1, presents man's degrading passions and man's depraved nature. From chapter 2 on, he begins to show how God, in his mercy and grace, worked his perfect plan from Abraham all the way through to the cross to provide us with his salvation. And for that, we are grateful. And one of the ways we demonstrate that gratitude is in worship. Personal worship daily, which is what you're doing through reading the word, praying, journaling. Corporate worship on the weekend. And I'm excited because this weekend we're going to have one service. We're starting things at 9:45 with connect groups. Remember, starting at 9:45 with connect groups. We will not have 8:30 worship. 9:45 connect groups. Then at 11 o'clock, we'll have worship, which is our standard time, 11 o'clock. And from that, we'll transition back to the NPR, where we're going to enjoy our fellowship meal. We've moved it from different times, just trying to get more and more people involved in that. So I'm encouraging you. I really want to urge you, join us for this special time in worship first, in small group first, connect groups, 9:45. Worship then 11 o'clock, then going together in the NPR for a time of fellowship, giving thanks to God for his rich blessings that he has poured out over us. And I'm looking forward to seeing you because I don't want you to miss out on any of that. Don't bypass any of it. Don't just come to small group and then leave out of convenience. Instead, stay for your commitment to worship and your desire to be in community. Let's enjoy a time together this coming Sunday. And until we are together this Sunday, live sent.